Okay, so it's 1770 in an English county town, and you need work that pays. You've got arithmetic. Not shopkeeper arithmetic. You can run a column of six-figure numbers through a table of logarithms and come out the other side without losing a digit. And you can hold that up for hours at a table by a window, because window light is free and candles are not. Every few weeks a packet arrives by post. Inside are instructions from the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, and a block of work. The position of the moon against a fixed set of stars, at 3-hour intervals, for a stretch of a year that hasn't happened yet. 4 years out. Sometimes more. You fill the columns. Ink thickens in the cold, so the pot stays near the hearth, and January runs slower than June. A finished page is something like 8 hours of your life, more if the figures fight you. Then it goes back into a packet, back down the post road, and you don't see it again. Nobody at Greenwich reads your page on its own. Somebody reads it against somebody else's. The job had a title, computer. That's what the accounts called you, about a century and a half before the word attached itself to a machine. And the picture most people carry of that work is a clerk copying figures. Low stakes, low pay, anyone with a pen could do it. A human photocopier with a quill. That's the version everyone knows. Commonly cited figures put the annual rate for one of these posts at around £70 a year, in pounds of the 1760s and 70s, with no inflation conversion applied. That wasn't pocket money. And this wasn't a post you applied for out of nowhere. The observatory hired by reputation. A schoolmaster who'd published a set of tables, a surveyor known for clean work, a clergyman with a mathematical habit. The work went to people who already had a name for not making mistakes. But hold the number loosely, because its size isn't the interesting part. Whose number it is, that's the interesting part. £70 is the rate for a computer holding a standing annual allotment of work, and that's the tier most of these people sat in. It isn't the rate paid to the person whose job was to check them. That one was paid more, for producing no new figures at all. So the accounts describe a system paying well, and paying most at the point furthest from the arithmetic, which tells you something about what the arithmetic was worth. It also tells you where the money in this system pooled, not where you'd guess. You're not being paid to produce the number. You're being paid to be the reason someone can trust it. Everything else in this job comes out of that sentence. The way the observatory hired. The postage. The rule about who you weren't allowed to live near. And the reason the whole thing was gone in about 65 years. This is a capacity ceiling job. That's the death type, and it's worth naming early, because it isn't the one people expect. A capacity ceiling means every unit of output needs a person, and the supply of people who can do that unit doesn't grow when demand does. The work can't be stretched. It can only be added to, one human at a time. Nothing about this job was ever going to get cheaper by doing more of it. Now, the demand was real, and it was expensive. A ship out of sight of land can find its latitude off the sun without much trouble. Longitude is the hard one. You're asking how far east or west you've come, and the sky doesn't hand that over. One workable answer was the moon. The moon moves fast against the fixed stars, fast enough that its position works as a clock face that everyone on Earth can see at once. Measure the angle between the moon and a chosen star. Look up what time that angle corresponds to at Greenwich. Compare it to your local time, and the difference converts into degrees of longitude. That only works if somebody has already written down where the moon will be. Not roughly, to arc minutes, at 3-hour intervals, for every day of a year that hasn't arrived yet. And it has to be in the navigator's hands before he sails, which means the tables have to be finished years ahead of the year they describe. There was no cheaper way to get that. In 1767, the mathematics existed. The mechanical means to execute it did not. So the observatory bought the only thing available, which was human arithmetic, distributed across the country, and paid by the page. And the state paid for it, through the board that administered the longitude problem. That part matters more than it sounds. The person who benefits from a correct lunar table is a ship owner with cargo in the water. The person who pays for it is the exchequer. So the price of the tables was never set against what a navigator could afford. It was set against what a wrecked ship cost the nation, and against that comparison, a handful of men doing sums at kitchen tables was cheap. Cheap and finite, which is the whole problem, and we'll get to it. Because there wasn't one kind of computer. There were about 4, and they weren't paid the same, and they weren't exposed to the same risk. At the top sat the comparer. Records from the period point to only 1 or 2 of these at any given moment. The comparer received both independent versions of the same month, and read them against each other, line by line, hunting for the places where they disagreed. Paid the most, produced nothing. Below that, the computer on a standing annual allotment. This is the tier that mattered, because it's where most of the people were, and it's the tier the survival arithmetic later in this video runs on. You had a known quantity of work each year, a known rate, and a working relationship with the observatory that renewed. Some of these posts ran for decades. Then the occasional computer, brought in for a supplementary table, a one-off correction, a section somebody else had failed to deliver. Same arithmetic, no continuity, no allotment. Paid for the job and then off the books until the next gap. And then a 4th tier that doesn't appear in the accounts at all, because the accounts only had room for 1 name per contract. The work was done at home. Homes contain other people. Research on the period has documented cases where a contract carried one man's name while the arithmetic was produced by his household, and at least one case where a woman continued holding the work for decades after the named contract holder had died, under his name, because under the law and commercial custom of the time, she could not hold it under her own. The name on the ledger is not a head count, it's a legal formality about who was permitted to sign. So 4 tiers, 1 contract line each, and a large gap between what the top tier was paid and what the bulk of the workforce was paid. Now, what did it cost to get in? Here's the structural point. There was no guild, no license, no examination, no apprenticeship indenture, no fee to a company for the right to practice. On paper, entry was free, and it does work, right up until it doesn't. The barrier was the arithmetic itself, and the arithmetic was years of unpaid preparation, not the ability to add, the ability to run spherical trigonometry through 7-figure logarithm tables and land within arc minutes, repeatedly, for 8 hours, without the accumulated drift that a single misread digit produces 4 columns later. People got there by teaching mathematics, by surveying, by astronomy as a private pursuit. In every case, somebody had already spent years of unpaid time before the observatory would send them a single page. Then the tools, and you bought your own. Logarithm tables and reference ephemerides were the working instruments of this job, and a good set was a serious purchase against a schoolmaster's income. Paper by the ream, because the work was longhand and you kept the intermediate steps. Candles, because November in England is 4 hours of usable light. And then there's the part almost nobody accounts for. Postage. Britain before the postal reforms of 1840, charged by distance and by the number of sheets. 2 sheets cost twice 1 sheet. 300 miles cost more than 50. And in the usual arrangement, the recipient paid on delivery, not the sender. Now put that against a job whose entire physical output is sheets of paper, in quantity, traveling a few hundred miles, several times a year, in both directions. Instructions out from Greenwich. Completed pages back. Queries when a figure looked wrong. Corrected pages after that. Every disagreement between 2 computers set off another exchange, and every exchange was billed by the sheet. So the freight cost of this job scaled with exactly the thing you were paid to produce. Produce more pages, ship more sheets. Produce them accurately, and the traffic stops there. Produce them with 1 arc minute of drift, and the correspondence multiplies, at your expense, for a page you were paid for once. Nobody wrote that into the contract as a cost of accuracy, but that's what it was. Here's a question with a right answer, and most people pick the wrong one. A system produces a page of lunar tables. The money that system spends on labor goes somewhere. Does the larger share go to producing the figures, or to establishing that the figures are correct? Pick one before you hear the answer. Producing, or checking. It's checking, and not by a small margin. Read that again. Every page in the Nautical Almanac was computed twice, by two people working independently, who did not see each other's results. Then, a third person, the comparer, read both versions against each other. 3 passes of human labor per page. 2 of those 3 produce no new information about the moon whatsoever. The second computer's page is not new knowledge. It's an audit of the first one, dressed as arithmetic. So of 3 units of human labor spent on a page, 1 is production, and 2 are verification. Roughly 2/3 of the labor in the system exists to establish trust in the remaining third. And the pay structure follows the labor structure, which is how you know it wasn't an accident. The comparer, who touched no fresh calculation, sat above the computers in the pay order. The observatory was buying certainty, and it priced certainty above output, because it understood which of the two was scarce. Now, why would anyone build it that way? This is where the economics gets sharp. The value of a lunar table is not proportional to its accuracy. It's a step function. A table accurate to arc minutes is worth the price of a ship. A table with 1 transposed digit in 1 row on 1 day is worth less than nothing, because a navigator who trusts it will place his vessel somewhere it isn't, with total confidence. There's no partial credit. An almanac that's right 99 times out of 100 isn't nearly as useful as one that's right. It's a liability, wearing the costume of an instrument. So the observatory faced a cost problem with an unusual shape. Producing a figure was cheap and repeatable. Proving a figure was clean was neither. There's no way to look at a single column of longhand trigonometry and see that it's right. The only available proof was replication. Have a second person walk the same road alone and see if they arrive at the same place. That's a verification technology built entirely out of people, which is fine at the scale of 1 almanac. Now, here's where it breaks down. Every increase in accuracy required more independent human passes, and human passes were the one input that couldn't be manufactured. Britain had shipwrights, foundries, and rope walks that could all scale with demand. It had perhaps a few dozen people at any moment capable of this specific arithmetic, at this specific standard. Records from the period point to only around 4 to 6 computers on the books at once, with 1 or 2 comparers above them. That's the ceiling. Not a shortage of money, and not a shortage of demand. A shortage of the only device that could check the work, which was another human being who had already spent years learning the same trade. Now, the other side of the ledger. Follow the money, and the shape of the risk shows up. The chain ran like this. The board administering the longitude problem held the funds. The astronomer royal at Greenwich distributed the work and set the rates. 2 computers received allotments and were paid by the page. The comparer was paid for reading the months. Then the printer, and then the volume reached a navigator. The computer sat near the bottom of that chain, not at the bottom, and not badly paid, but near the bottom, and, more to the point, at the end of the chain where a specific cost landed. Payment by the page has a property that payment by the day does not. It fixes the price of a page before anyone knows how much labor that page will take. And in this job, the labor a page took was not determined by the page. It was determined by whether a stranger 3 counties away made a mistake. Consider what happens when 2 versions disagree. The comparer finds a divergence in 1 row. Now somebody has to locate the error, which means recomputing a block of work, by hand, to find where the 2 paths separated. That work is not a new page. It generates no new payment. And the computer doing it has no way of knowing in advance whether the error is his or the other man's, so both of them may end up rechecking, and only one of them was wrong. So the effective rate per hour of a computer's year was set partly by his own accuracy and partly by the accuracy of a person he had never met and was specifically not allowed to write to. The rate was a piece rate on output. The risk was a shared risk on error. The comparer had none of that exposure. He was the only person in the system who could see both versions, which meant he was the only person whose work could not be independently checked. There was no comparer for the comparer. That's the position paid above the arithmetic, and the reason is structural rather than personal. Its output was the thing being sold. And nobody in this arrangement was confused about any of it. The computers took the work because a standing allotment from the observatory was reliable annual income attached to a reputation for exactness, and because it sat on top of a day job rather than replacing one. A schoolmaster with an allotment had 2 incomes and 1 skill. That's a rational position to hold, and many of them held it for 20 or 30 years. Now, the strangest clause in the whole arrangement. The 2 computers assigned to the same month were not to be near each other. Different towns, no correspondence about the work, no sight of each other's figures. Not for reasons of secrecy. The moon's position isn't confidential. The reason is arithmetic. 2 people who talk about a problem tend to make the same mistake, and 2 identical wrong answers agree perfectly. Agreement is the only signal the comparer has. So correlated errors don't just fail to help, they destroy the check by producing a false confirmation that no one downstream can detect, which means the isolation was a design specification, not a preference. The independence of the 2 passes was the product. Any contact between the 2 computers degraded it. So one of the working conditions of this job was that you were paid, in part, to have no professional contact with the only other person in England doing your exact task that month. By the 1790s, the system was working, and working at volume. British merchant tonnage was climbing, the naval establishment was expanding, and the almanac had become standard equipment rather than a curiosity for the mathematically inclined. Editions were being printed years in advance, on schedule. Foreign navies bought copies. The method had won the argument against its rivals, and the arithmetic behind it was arriving on time. So far, so good. The first signal came from the instrument makers, and it didn't look like a threat. Sextants and circles kept getting better. A navigator in 1815 could measure an angle more finely than a navigator in 1770, which is an improvement in the ordinary sense, and it created a problem with a very specific shape. An instrument that measures more precisely than your tables are computed is an instrument you can't fully use. The moment observation got sharper than the almanac became the limiting component, and the fix for that is more decimal places, which sounds like more time. It wasn't more time, it was more people. Here's why. Extending a calculation to another order of precision multiplies the intermediate steps, and every intermediate step is another place a hand can slip. So the error rate per page goes up exactly when the tolerance for error goes down, which means the verification burden rises faster than the computation burden. A more precise almanac doesn't need computers working longer. It needs more independent passes on the same page, and the independent pass was the input Britain didn't have. By the 1820s, astronomers in Britain were complaining publicly that the almanac was no longer accurate enough for the instruments in their hands. The complaint was about output quality. The cause was a labor ceiling nobody had a way to raise. And then somebody proposed removing the ceiling entirely. In the 1820s, a calculating engine was designed and part built in England, with government funding, and the problem it was aimed at was precisely this one: not arithmetic speed, arithmetic trust, a machine that computes a table mechanically and, in the original conception, prints it directly, eliminates both the second independent pass and the comparer, because there's no transcription step for a human error to enter. The engine wasn't proposed to work faster than a computer. It was proposed to make checking unnecessary. It never entered production. Development ran for years, the funding relationship ended, and no astronomical table in this period was ever produced by machine. So the ceiling stayed, and what got over it wasn't a machine at all. The board administering the longitude problem was abolished in 1828. In the early 1830s, the production of the almanac was reorganized into a permanent office, with a superintendent and salaried staff working in one place. That's the extinction event, an office. Now, why an office beat a distributed network of the best arithmeticians in the country, in strictly economic terms rather than technical ones? Three things collapsed at once. Postage went to zero, not reduced, gone, for internal traffic, because the two computers and the comparer were now down the corridor from each other. Every query, correction, and disputed row that used to travel by post road at a per-sheet charge became a conversation. Error detection time collapsed with it. Under the distributed model, the gap between a slip of the pen and its discovery was measured in weeks, because the page had to travel to Greenwich, wait for its counterpart, get compared, and travel back with a query. In one building it's the same day, and in a system where 2/3 of the labor is verification, cutting the verification cycle from weeks to hours doesn't make the work slightly cheaper. It changes how much verification you can afford to buy per page. And the reference libraries consolidated. One set of logarithm tables and ephemerides, serving 10 salaried staff, purchased once by the institution, instead of every computer in England buying and maintaining his own out of his own rate. None of that made the arithmetic faster. Each pass still took a person the same number of hours. What changed was the overhead attached to every pass, and since the system spent 2/3 of its labor on passes that produced nothing new, the overhead on verification was the whole cost problem. For the people holding standing allotments, the change appears in the records as an absence. Outsourced allotments weren't renewed. The job title stops appearing in the accounts. Some of the work went to the new salaried establishment, some of the people did not, and within a few years the arrangement of paying an independent arithmetician by the page had ended. Now, the survival arithmetic. Three things have to be stated first, or the number is meaningless. 1. This is the standing annual allotment tier, the one most computers sat in, not the comparer's rate. 2. The output arrived over most months of the year, at a few hours a day, alongside other employment. So this is supplementary income, not a full-time wage, and it has to be compared as supplementary income. 3. £70 a year is the nominal rate. It is not money in hand. Against agricultural day wages of roughly 1 shilling to 1 shilling and sixpence in England, in the 1770s, £70 buys somewhere in the region of 1,100 to 1,600 days of ordinary labor, which is 4 to 5 years of a farm laborer's entire working life, for a few hours a day at a table, on top of a salary you already had. Historians put annual rent for a modest household outside London in the range of £8 to £15, so the allotment covers roughly 5 years of the roof. Records from the period suggest a quartern loaf ran around 5 to 7 pence, putting £70 somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 loaves. Now subtract. Postage in both directions, billed by distance and sheet, paper by the ream, and candles for the dark half of the year. Reference tables, bought once but expensively, and the recomputation you performed at no additional payment every time your figures and a stranger's diverged. None of those are recorded per person, so the deduction can't be totaled honestly. The direction is clear enough. Every one of them scaled with pages, and pages were exactly what you were paid for, which leaves a rate that looked like 4 years of a laborer's life and behaved like a piece rate carrying somebody else's mistakes. The arithmetic itself is now worth nothing, and that's the least interesting part of what happened to this job. Lunar position for any moment across centuries sits inside the end user's own device, computed on demand, at a marginal cost that rounds to zero. Nobody is paid to produce it. Nobody checks it. The output of 4 to 6 of the most exacting arithmeticians in Britain, working most of the year, is now a background function nobody notices running. But look at what the observatory was actually buying, and the picture changes. It wasn't buying the figures, It was buying the three-seat structure. One party produces, a second party independently reproduces, a third party reconciles the two and owns the answer. That structure is not obsolete. It's everywhere that a single wrong figure is expensive. Two independent systems computing the same total, and a reconciliation function reading them against each other. Two signatures required before a transaction moves, specifically so that no single hand completes it. An independent recalculation performed for no purpose other than confirming a result that already exists. A person whose entire function is reviewing the output of an automated system that has already produced the answer. In each case, the same economics apply. The production pass is cheap and getting cheaper. The verification passes are the expensive ones, and the seat that pays best is the reconciling seat, because it's the one whose output is the trust rather than the number. So the function didn't die. It moved, and it kept its pay ranking on the way across. The headcount question can't be answered honestly. There's no register of people whose job is verifying machine output. Because it isn't a job title, it's a component of thousands of job titles. What can be said is which seat disappeared and which survived. The seat that produced the figure is the one that went into the machine. The seat that established the figure could be trusted is the one still occupied by a person, still being paid, and still positioned above the arithmetic in the pay order. Now the counterfactual, and it comes down to one variable: the cost of a second independent computation pass. That's it, not the cost of the first one. If the price of an independent second pass had gone to near zero around 1830, the distributed piece rate model survives, because postage, delay, and duplicated reference libraries were overheads on verification, not on arithmetic. Take verification overhead to zero, and there's no reason to gather anyone into a building. Every computer stays at his own window in his own county, paid by the page, checked by a machine that never gets tired at hour 7. The engine designed to do exactly that was under construction in England while these men were still filing pages. It was never finished, and its funding relationship ended in the following decade. So the variable that would have saved the job existed as a design, sat in a workshop, and stopped. The distance between the job surviving and the job ending was one machine that got built part way. Which brings us back to the table by the window. The light was free, the candles were not, and the pages went out by post to be read against a stranger's. Whoever held that job was never selling the figures on those pages. You're not being paid to produce the number. You're being paid to be the reason someone can trust it. 3 seats: producer, second producer, reconciler. Which one are you sitting in, and what would it cost to automate the seat next to you?